I actually want to see that tap dance. Although I did go to Mass before and prayed that I would not start coughing. Thank you all so much. I feel so grateful to be back here at St. Thomas. This is a place that more than any place I know lives out its mission to integrate faith and reason in the search for truth, focusing on morality and social justice. I mean, you see it everywhere in what you do in the Community Justice Center and the Immigration Clinic, and Professor Mark Osler's first in the country federal clemency clinic here. And this conference today, I think that all of us have been so moved by this morning, and the other speakers. I can only say thank you to all of them, and to Miss Monica, the heart of this day for me. So thank you. A special thank you to Hank Shea, who is irreplaceable. And this conference, this symposium, is just the latest in a long line of good works that he's done throughout his life and career, and this relentless determination to do justice in a better way. So thank you, Hank. So Hank mentioned this, yes. This is the first time I've told this story in public, and I can't think of a more perfect place to do it, so thank you. And it starts the way all good stories do. Once upon a time, there were three families. My family. I'm one of three girls, three daughters in the family. We grew up in Oklahoma City, this heartland place that was settled by pioneers and lived this philosophy of neighbor helping neighbor. Another family was Bud Welch. Bud is a gas station owner from Oklahoma City, Oklahoma. He had 2 sons and 1 daughter. And Bill Mcveigh, an auto parts worker from Western New York, had 3 children, 2 daughters and a son. Bud, Bill, and I are linked by tragedy. Each of us lost a family member to a deliberate killing, and each of them died young. The first to die was my sister Nancy at the age of 25. When she was 3 months pregnant, Nancy and her husband, Richard, were coming home from a family dinner celebrating the announcement of her pregnancy, only to find a killer waiting for her in the dark. He handcuffed Richard. He took them down to the basement. He shot Richard once in the head, execution style, and then shot my pregnant sister in her stomach twice and left her there to die. The second to die, 5 years later to the month, was 23-year-old Julie Marie Welch, the only daughter of Bud Welch. She was fluent in Spanish, and she worked as an interpreter for the Social Security Administration on the first floor. And she was killed when an explosion killed her and 167 other innocent people, men, women, and children, in the Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma City. And then 6 years later, the last to die of the children was the only son of Bill Mcveigh, Timothy Mcveigh. He was 26 years old when he planted that bomb, and he was executed for his crime by the federal government 6 years later. The nexus between us, between me, Bud, and Bill, is Oklahoma City, this place broken but unbound by evil. Oklahoma City lost its children too. There were 19 children that were killed in that bombing, 15 from the daycare and another 4 in other parts of the building. Love didn't leave me in the place I was when Nancy and Richard were first murdered, when I was fine with throwing away the life of the young man who had done the crime, a 16-year-old boy who pulled that trigger. Love led me instead to a mailbox where I stood with a letter in hand to that young man, writing to him in prison, telling him I had forgiven him and reaching out to reconcile with him. It was in the course of that trek from fear to freedom that I found these heroes of reconciliation to me, Bud and Bill. Sometimes we imagine that it's facts and argument that change people's minds and hearts, but as a lawyer, I know that isn't true. It really is stories that change people's minds and hearts, that transform us. This story I'm about to tell you is such a story. It's a story of these 2 fathers that found each other in the tangled aftermath of this bombing and found that vengeance only begets vengeance and hate only begets hate. But reconciliation is different, that it heals us and heals our world one human heart at a time. These two fathers should have been enemies. Earthly reason would have dictated so, but that is not what happened. So I'm going to take you back to April 19th, 1995, Oklahoma City, Oklahoma. And here in Minneapolis and where I live in Chicago, in April it's usually still freezing cold and we still have our sweaters and parkas on. But in Oklahoma City, it was a beautiful, warm spring day that day, the kind of day that you roll down your car windows and you wear your shirt sleeves to work. The mayor's prayer breakfast had just let out, and people were going into their offices to work. There was a woman named Florence Rogers who worked in the credit union on the 3rd floor, and she was convening a meeting of 8 young women who were working with her in the credit union. A guy named Dan Weber, who was a young law clerk, had just dropped off his 18-month-old son at the daycare on the 2nd floor. It was called America's Kids Daycare. And there was a woman named Sheila Driver who was pregnant, who was going into her office. And Julie Marie Welch walked into her 1st floor office on the 1st floor, the Social Security Administration. She had just come from Mass at her church, St. Charles Borromeo in Oklahoma City. Julie was a daily communicant the last 2 years of her life, and she started a preschool class for kids who had just moved to Oklahoma from Mexico who didn't speak English because Julie was fluent in Spanish, and she loved the children and they loved her. But she was looking forward to another job. She was hoping to be a Spanish teacher and had gotten a job offer for that fall. She was also looking ahead to getting engaged to her longtime boyfriend, Air Force Lieutenant Eric Hiltz. That morning, Julie's dad was at home. He hadn't gone yet to his job at the Texaco station on 39th Street. He was a protective dad. He was a dad that when Julie went to college called her every day. Far away in western New York, in a town called Pendleton, Bill Mcveigh was getting ready to go and he had just gotten home from his overnight shift on the plant. He worked for a GM factory manufacturing radiators. It's a job he held for almost 40 years. And Bill Mcveigh is a guy who belongs to things, not just his UAW union, but his Catholic church where he ran the bingo, the Veterans Association in the town where he helped do the books, the Little League, the fire company where he was a volunteer. He didn't know then that at that moment his only son, Tim, was driving a Ryder truck that he had rented loaded full of explosives, driving it to the very building where Julie Marie worked, this 9-story, multi-million-dollar glass and steel building, the Murrah Federal Building. He had packed the truck with ammonium nitrate. He had designed 2 fuses, one to take 5 minutes to burn and the other to take 2, so that if one failed, the other one would set it off. All he needed was an ordinary cigarette lighter to light it. The truck was also full of hate. Timothy Mcveigh hated the federal government. He wanted to strike a blow against it as retaliation and revenge for what he saw as the excesses of the government against its own citizens. And particularly, he was angered over the deaths of 76 men, women, and children in a conflagration in Waco, Texas. There was a standoff between the ATF and FBI and this cult called the Branch Davidians in this compound. And when the ATF launched tear gas into the compound and the fire started, all of these people inside died. So Mcveigh had picked the exact 2nd anniversary of that conflagration in Waco to set off the bomb in Oklahoma City at this federal building. So we know that profile, the young, angry, white male, armed and ready to do violence. And he learned that hate when he was in the Army and met his 2 co-conspirators, Terry Nichols and Michael Fortier. Nichols was a guy who was raised in this kind of militia, area of Michigan, very anti-government, tried to renounce his U.S. citizenship, tore up his passport and IDs. When he was brought to court for not paying his debts on his credit cards or his child support, he said that the court didn't have jurisdiction over him. Fortier lived in this place called Kingman, Arizona, which is a hotbed of anti-government militias, and had a flag flying outside his trailer that said, "Don't tread on me," meaning the government, stay away. So Mcveigh pulled up this truck to the loading area by the building, right by the first floor where Julie worked, just underneath the windows to the second floor daycare. He lit the fuses. He put earplugs in his own ears because he had prepared so thoroughly that he knew that he needed that to ward off the hearing damage that might come from the loud sound of the bomb. I think you'll recall that in the Boston Marathon bombing, one of the really gruesome injuries, besides people losing their legs and being maimed in other ways, that so many people were rendered deaf from the explosion of the bomb. So Mcveigh brought earplugs to protect his own ears. At that moment, Julie had been working in the back in a stockroom with 3 other women. And she was called to the front because there was an appointment. There was a man named Emilio Tapia Rangel who didn't speak English and who needed her help in doing the business he needed to do at the Social Security office. And so she was called to the front. All 3 of the young women who stayed back in that closet working survived. They were rescued 45 minutes later. So Julie didn't know when she was going to the front that she was going to her doom, that the dreams of teaching that class of Spanish or of marrying Eric would never be. At 9:02, the bomb went off. The spark had met the charge. And the Ryder truck exploded with an almost unimaginable force. And I just want to read to you from the official record of the Oklahoma City bombing what happened when that truck exploded. The first wave of super hot gas moved at 7,000 miles per hour, fast enough that someone 10 feet away would have been hit by a force of 37 tons. In about a half second, the gas dissipated, only to be replaced by an equally violent vacuum. The resulting pressure wave moved outward, lifting the building up and causing beams, floor slabs, and connections to weaken or collapse. When the pressure wave passed, gravity took over. 9 stories on the north side of the building pancaked, creating a crater some 30 feet deep. So the whole front of the glass, the building, sheared off. People who survived the bombing remember seeing people across from them flinging their arms up in the air as if they were doing the wave at a football game. In fact, they were falling through space. People on the 9th floor ended up on the first. After the bombing had happened and people were being recovered, bodies were being recovered, the dentists who were identifying people by dental records recall everyone's face looking like Edward Munch's The Scream, that painting where, like that, because the force of the air had blown into their lungs and frozen them in death in this last ghastly expression. The young women in the credit union, all 8 of them, disappeared before Florence Rogers' eyes. All 8 of them died. Florence alone survived, clinging to this precipice of about 14 inches on a ledge that once had been the floor of her office. Dan Weber ran when he heard the explosion, ran from his own damaged office a few blocks away, ran to the second floor, a kind of a plaza that was right by the second floor where he had dropped off his only child, his little son. And everything he saw there was no more second floor. There was only this pile of rubble. He saw these tiny shoes sticking out, the shoes of his son, and an officer helped pull out this child, and he was alive, one of only 6 of the children pulled alive. And he told a newspaper later that it was like losing everything that mattered to you and then having it given back again. Sheila Driver was buried in rubble, and the first responders who showed up were asking her to talk, to say her name, and they were elated when they pulled her out alive, and were devastated later when they found that she had died on the way to the hospital. Even though it took first responders days and even weeks to go through finding everyone's remains, they found no survivors after that first day. Everyone was dead. Miles away, back at home, Bud Welch heard this enormous boom. And he was there with his son, and they said, "What is that?" And then the phone rang, and it was Bud's brother, Frank. And he said, "Turn on the TV, there's been some kind of explosion downtown." And Bud said that when he saw the front of the building, his heart just sank because he knew that's exactly where Julie would have worked and where she would have been. Right then at that moment, Bill Mcveigh was getting ready to go out and do the bingo at his church, his Catholic church, Good Shepherd Church in Lockport, New York. And the news came on about this catastrophe in Oklahoma City, and he thought maybe it was a gas explosion. But when he got to the bingo that night, the ladies that were there told him that no, it had been a deliberate attack. And he didn't yet know that his own son had been the attacker. The bombing shocked the nation and the world. It was the deadliest strike on American soil since Pearl Harbor. It is still the most deadly domestic act of terrorism in the nation's history, at 168 people dead. And it happened in this modest city where I grew up, this place of farmers, ranchers that would plow your field if you got sick or take care of you if your barn burned down. And Oklahomans are used to having catastrophe come at them from the sky, from tornadoes, from the Dust Bowl that ravaged crops in the 30s, from the hail that would dent your car if you parked it in the driveway, overnight. They weren't used to having catastrophe come at them from the ground, from a place as ordinary as a man parking a truck on the street. Oklahoma City responded with unity and love. There was an immediate outpouring of help from everyone. When the dogs that were sniffing for survivors were hurting their paws on broken glass, the word went out and all these paw protectors would come in. The first responders who came from other places, from New York City, from as far away as California and from the South, came and checked out of a hotel or tried to pay for the meal they'd just eaten at a restaurant. They found that no one in Oklahoma City would take their money. The nickname they called it is the Oklahoma dollar, that the same dollar they came with is the one they left with, because there was such gratitude for the help that came in. When the credit union where Florence Rogers and those 8 women worked was blown apart, all the cash in their vaults went floating out into the street. The people in Oklahoma City returned all the money, such that the money they got back was actually more than what had been lost from the vault. The buildings all around within like a 30-block radius had all their windows blown out and crashed to the ground, including the banks. The cash drawers were left open, and they were untouched. There was not a single act of looting. The tale of how Timothy Mcveigh, the nation's worst domestic terrorist, was apprehended is actually the story of a civil servant, an ordinary civil servant doing his job faithfully and well. So when Timothy Mcveigh left the bombing site, he got into a beat-up Mercury that he had planted as a getaway car, and he'd taken the license plates off the back. And so when Trooper Charlie Hanger saw this Mercury driving on I-35 and had no license tag, he pulled it over. And when he saw the outline of the Glock that Tim Mcveigh had strapped to him, he put his gun up and said, you're under arrest, because it was unlawful to be carrying a loaded gun in a car at that time in Oklahoma. So Trooper Hanger placed Timothy Mcveigh under arrest and took him to this little town called Perry, Oklahoma, in Noble County, and put him in the jail on 4 misdemeanor charges, where he probably would have been let go if not for a fluke. Because the town was so small, the judge that was there wasn't available that first day to have a bond hearing for Mcveigh, so it was held to the next day. And the next day, the judge's son was late for the bus, and so that put it off too. By this time, the FBI had found the axle of the Ryder truck and was able to link it to a guy who had rented this truck, and they got this sketch of this sharp-featured young man with a buzz cut. And they took it to Harrington, Kansas, where the truck was rented, and walked all around the town and asked, has anybody seen this guy? And a woman from the Dreamland Motel, where Timothy Mcveigh had stayed the night before the bombing, said, yes, I recognize him. And she showed the ledger where he'd signed in under his own name, Timothy Mcveigh. They ran his name through a database and were stunned to discover that there was a Timothy Mcveigh in custody in Little Noble County Jail. The FBI got on the phone and yelled, hold him, and they rushed there to place him under arrest. And they transferred him to federal custody, and some of you old enough to remember will remember this indelible moment in American history when this sharp-featured young white male with a buzz cut in an orange jumpsuit is taken out into daylight, blinking in the sun. And the crowd that had gathered when they heard that the person who committed this heinous crime was in custody gathered to yell at him, baby killer, murderer. Bud Welch had the TV on at that time, and he saw that perp walk of Timothy McVeigh. And he hoped at that moment that the sniper would just take him out right there. He hoped for a Jack Ruby moment. Remember when John F. Kennedy was assassinated and Lee Harvey Oswald was placed under arrest, and as he's being transported by law enforcement, someone stepped forward and just shot him dead right there. And the death penalty wasn't fast enough for Bud Welch. He wanted Timothy McVeigh dead. The day after Tim's arrest, the FBI flew Bill McVeigh from Pendleton, New York, to Oklahoma City to talk to him to see if there was anything that Tim might tell him about who else might have helped him do this. And despite Bill's efforts, Tim refused to say anything. And that same day, that Saturday, Bud got the terrible news he'd been expecting, that Julie's body had been found in the rubble. He and his wife and Julie's boyfriend, Eric, went to see her at the mortuary. The whole left side of her head had been crushed in. Her neck was broken, her foot was almost severed. She had lacerations all over her face. And it wasn't until then Bud said that he really accepted that his only daughter, his baby, was dead. And when that happened, he just descended into darkness. He was drinking, almost blackout drinking every night. He was smoking 4 packs of cigarettes a day, nonstop. And he was obsessively going day after day to the ruins of the Murrah building. By now it's surrounded by this chain link fence that was, people would leave teddy bears and candles and things on. And his customers at the Texaco station said, like, Bud, you're killing yourself. And he said, the sooner I die, the sooner I get to heaven and see my daughter Julie again. But over time, Bud realized that this wasn't healing him, that all of his hate and all of his desire for revenge was actually killing him. He started thinking about why had Timothy McVeigh done this, and when he found that it was just really retaliation and revenge for Waco, he said, well, retaliation, revenge, bloodshed, tit for tat, it will never end. And so he had a change of heart about what he wanted, that he no longer wanted revenge, or he wanted instead to reach out and forgive Timothy McVeigh. By this time, McVeigh's case had been wandering through the courts. It was transferred from Oklahoma to Colorado for trial because it was agreed by everyone that the man this hated for this heinous crime could not possibly get a fair trial in the state of Oklahoma. So he was found guilty, and then he was sentenced to death, despite Bill's pleas to spare his son. So before he was going to be executed, the journalist Ed Bradley from 60 Minutes convened a handful of survivors of the Oklahoma City bombing victims, including Bud Welch, asking them, if you had a chance to talk to Timothy McVeigh before he was executed, what would you say to him? And the first guy said, I'd say, Tim, why don't you be a man and tell us, who else was in on it? We don't believe you, it was only you. And then a woman said, I would just, beg him to, tell us more, that kind of thing. And then Ed Bradley turned to Bud, and Bud said, what I'd want to do is I'd want to take a picture of my daughter Julie and show it to him. And I'd point out to him that they were about the same age. And if they'd grown up in the same neighborhood, they possibly would have been buddies. And I want so much for him to ask for forgiveness before he dies. And Bradley looked absolutely stunned by that, just stunned that what he wanted was not an answer and not revenge, but that what he wanted was that moment of forgiveness. And Bud and I have spoken together a lot against the death penalty over the years. That's how we know each other best. And Bud always says that it's a hole in his heart that he never got, not only to maybe hear Tim's request for forgiveness, but for him to offer it no matter what. Just to say, I forgive you. So Bud and Bill never met during the trial. Bud didn't really want to go to much of the trial, and Bill didn't want to go for much either. So they had never met. But Bud saw him early on in the process, right after the bombing and the arrest of Tim McVeigh. Bud remembered seeing him on the TV news, and the news camera had gone to Bill McVeigh's home. He's got this big garden in this big backyard in this rural area of western New York where he grows corn and potatoes and peas and things and gives it away to his neighbors for free. And Bill was stooped working in his garden, and Bud said he didn't even remember what Bill said, but he remembered when he turned to look at the camera and Bill looked up in the camera, that Bud could see this pain, this deep, deep pain in Bill Mcveigh's eyes. And he swore to himself that one day he would go to that grieving father and tell him that he understood how he felt. So when Bud wasn't able to meet with Timothy Mcveigh before he died, he decided to reach out to Bill Mcveigh instead. And he did it through a Catholic nun named Sister Rosalind Roslowski, who is a chaplain at the Attica prison in New York. That's her day job. Her night job is working at a kind of a halfway house, a reentry place for people who are being released on parole. And Bud got in touch with her and asked, assuming that she would know every Catholic in Western New York, did she know Bill Mcveigh? She sought him out, and she brokered this meeting in a beautiful sunny day in September. Bud drove out to see Bill Mcveigh. They walked in Bill's garden. They talked. They sat at Bill's kitchen table. And they learned all these things they had in common. Both of them very faithful Catholics, had come from big Irish Catholic families, both of them. Bud's one of 8 children. They both grown up on farms and had that in common. They both had gone to Catholic schools all the way through high school. Neither one went to college, both working men, Bud at the gas station, Bill working the furnace on the overnight shift at the factory. They each had 3 children. Both of them had been divorced, and both of them had lost this dear child that they loved. They had this incredible reconciliation. That's the only family member that Bill has ever had visit his house, the only one he stayed in touch with. They are enduring friends. Why does this matter for us? It matters because we have to learn how to respond to evil, because there's been no shortage of evil since that attack, right? We've had Newtown and Parkland and El Paso and Dayton and Tree of Life Synagogue and Mother Emanuel Baptist Church in Charleston. And we know that we have to respond. And if our response is hatred and vengeance, that will get us nowhere. It will just cause more bloodshed. We have the example of Bud and Bill of what restorative justice looks like. It looks like 2 people sitting down together and talking and understanding one another. The story matters because to me it shows the futility of responding to violence with more violence. We executed Timothy Mcveigh on June 11, 2001. And it was an execution he went to voluntarily. He was a volunteer. He withdrew his own appeals. He did not want to spend the rest of his life in prison, according to his dad. And one of the things he told journalists before he died, he said, they think they've got me, I'm some kind of trophy that with the death penalty they've won. He said, they haven't won. By the crudest terms, 168-1. And we know what he meant by that, right? I killed 168 people, and you're killing me. And so if it's supposed to be an eye for an eye, by your own math, I win. So he's killed, executed June 11, 2001, and 3 months later to the day, terrorists slammed airplanes into the World Trade Center and the Pentagon and the field in Pennsylvania. It did nothing to deter that act. The story, I think, matters because it teaches us that people can change. Bud went from hating Timothy Mcveigh and wanting him dead to reaching out in forgiveness to him. And if he can change, so can anyone. I think, too, the story matters because of you, of all of you, that you do not have to be transformed by evil or defeated by it. You don't have to become a hater because of hatred. We can transform this cycle of retaliation and revenge. We can turn brokenness into unity and peace into strife. And we can go out into this world redeeming it and making it whole. And may God bless you in the work that you do.
people have questions, put them on note cards and bring them up. Jeanne, you just touched briefly on your own personal journey, and many of the people here have not heard that story. Could you talk about the reconciliation piece, about how that came about and where things have gone?
Yeah, so the 16-year-old boy who killed my family members started out, denying the crime, totally remorseless, that took the stand at his trial and lied and said that someone else had done it when in fact he had. And so for years, I had thought that forgiving him was enough, like doing that in my own mind and heart and not reaching out to him at all, because my forgiveness was really for God and for Nancy and for me. It was for God, because we know as Christians that we're called on to forgive. We just said it in Mass and the Our Father that we say, forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. And I forgave for Nancy because she was this loving, generous, kind-hearted person, and I just didn't believe that her memorial should be hatred and vengeance. It needed to be something life-giving and healing and restoring. And so I spent, decades working against gun violence and working against the death penalty and anything that shed more blood or dug another grave of an innocent person. And I forgave for me because of this saying I write about in my book, that hating another person is like drinking poison and expecting that other person to die. And I didn't want to give him that power over me. But what I was challenged to see after meeting your law professor, Professor Mark Osler, who gave me a book written by one of his colleagues at an institution he taught at before here, Baylor, that every Christian man and woman has an obligation to try to work to reconcile with those who've wronged them. And when I read that, I was really challenged to reach out and write to David Biro, the young man who killed my family members, and say, I forgave you a long time ago, and I told the whole world, except you, the most important person of all. And I've waited all this time for you to apologize to me. I'm going to go first. I'm sorry. And I'll come see you if you want. And he wrote me back this incredible 15-page letter confessing to the crime for the first time and saying how very, very sorry he was. And it has been so healing for me to go and sit with him, to hear him tell me things about Nancy's last moments that were so helpful to know, and for me to be able to talk about Nancy, because the more he gets to know her, he says, the sorrier he is for what he did. And that's the best justice he can give me.
How about in terms of Timothy Mcveigh?
Oh.
Timothy Mcveigh, you've talked about him. I know he's covered a lot in the book. Was there ever any hint of regret on his part?
Yeah, so the question is, did Timothy Mcveigh ever show any regret for what he'd done? His father begged him to, because he knew how much it might mean to some of the victims' families, especially the parents of the children, for him to say that he was sorry. And he was steadfast to the last in not doing that. I think he perceived it as some kind of weakness to have done that. But on the way to the death chamber, he was speaking to a chaplain. And later the warden told Bill Mcveigh, Tim's dad, that he had sought forgiveness at the end. So I asked Bill when I was interviewing him for the book, do you hope to see Tim in heaven someday? And he said, yes, I hope so. And he said, I pray for him every day. And I asked him, well, what do you pray? And he looked at me like, no. And I realized I crossed this line that those prayers are precious to Bill and to God, whose son forgave a thief on the cross next to him.
Jeanne, some students are going to wonder, they don't know your whole career progression, but you were working for a big law firm downtown Chicago, and then after the murder of your sister and brother-in-law, you became a public defender, which you've been doing for quite some time now. how does somebody make that type of career change, and what do you say to others who have similar questions about where they should be devoting their career in their profession?
Yeah, so I started out my career as a corporate associate because this is so ironic, because I was scared to get up and talk in front of people. So I thought, well, this is something where I won't have to get up and talk in front of people. I'll just be working on documents. But the thing is, I was cheating my employer, and we're supposed to work for them as if for God. I was cheating them because it wasn't deeply meaningful to me. I didn't care deeply about it, and consequently, I think I was probably terrible at it. And what I really found joy in was the pro bono work I was able to do at the firm, representing Central American refugees seeking political asylum, working for nonprofit organizations, and finding that joy of really doing something useful in the world for a real human that I could see, instead of just kind of documents with zeros at the end. And so when Nancy died at the age of 25, I was just a few years older than her. And I realized that she had lost her life, and I was going to go on. I was going to have this gift of life that she no longer had been given. And I'd already been on the planet a couple of years longer than her, and I had wasted it. I had wasted it doing on something that wasn't deeply meaningful. And that's when I immediately, left the corporate law, and within months started my work as a public defender, where I've been ever since. And what I would say to the wonderful young people, at this law school and from other schools, is that your life is short. Nancy did not know when she came home from that dinner last night that that would be the last day, her last day on earth. And you have to do what you love and what matters deeply to you. Don't be afraid of anything. Don't listen to that voice in my head that I listen to saying, oh, I have student loans to pay, and what will I do? I need to take the highest paying job. Do what you believe in.
There's a question about people who are sentenced to life in prison as juveniles. It's been working its way. The Supreme Court has now spoken several times. In the case of David Biro, and I haven't kept up, but I know that there were some who were critical of your outreach to David Biro because it occurred shortly after the first favorable court decision, is my recollection, opening the door to the possibility of release, even though they had received life without parole type sentences. And I know you've met with David Biro since then. Where do you stand right now? If you were on a parole board, or if you were part of the decision-making process about whether someone like David Biro should ever be released?
So David has an unusual life without parole sentence. So in my state, the state of Illinois, back at the time he was sentenced, there still was such thing as the death penalty for juveniles in other states. We didn't have one in Illinois, but in Texas, Oklahoma, Florida, Missouri, they did have one. And so that's actually one of the things the press wanted to know when my family and I emerged from David's sentencing to life without parole. Like, aren't you disappointed he didn't get the death penalty? And that's when we were able to say, no, we don't believe in shedding more blood and digging another grave and creating this other grieving family. But the life sentences he got were two. He got a mandatory life sentence for killing the two adults. That was an automatic sentence, meaning that the judge had no power to give him any sentence but that once he was convicted of it. He was also, though, given a discretionary life sentence from the judge for killing the unborn baby, because Nancy and Richard had told him she was pregnant before he shot them to death. They'd actually, Richard had said, please don't hurt my wife, she's expecting, so he knew. When that case that you referred to happened, that was Miller versus Alabama in 2012, that only struck down the mandatory sentence. So when David Biro and I met, he had no hope whatsoever still of getting out of prison, regardless of what happened with Miller, because his discretionary life sentence for killing the baby still stands. Now that sentence is being challenged, and I don't believe in juvenile life sentences anymore, and I don't even believe, certainly not mandatory, and I don't even believe in them as a discretionary matter either. And that's just been argued before the U.S. Supreme Court in a case that I am on an amicus brief with other family members of murder victims. On the Malvo case, it was a young juvenile who, with an adult, kind of terrorized the Washington, D.C., Virginia area with these just random sniper shootings. So we're challenging now the giving of a sentence to any child, but saying that because you did this, now we will put you away forever without any second look at you. It's merciless and it's wrong.
So we don't often talk about love in law school. We had that said earlier today, and it's very true. Yeah. But I want you to make some closing comments here. But one thing I would like you to add, it's always been one of the most powerful parts of your first book for me, is to tell everybody here what your sister did in her last moments on earth.
Yeah, so Richard died right away when he was shot, execution style, but Nancy, the coroner said, lived on for about 10 minutes. And first she tried to call for help, and it's so unimaginable, but in 1990, when she was murdered, there's no such thing as a cell phone. She didn't have any way to call for help. So she tried to make noise with this tool. She was banging on a shelf that was in the basement with this metal tool. And I just imagine that at some point she must have known that no help was coming and that she was dying. So she dragged herself by her elbows over to where Richard's body lay on the floor because she was too weak to stand. And she dipped her finger in her own blood and she drew on the concrete floor next to him the shape of a heart and the letter U. Love you. Just how she used to sign her cards and letters to him. And to me, it was not just her message to him, this man that she loved so much and wanted to raise a family with and grow old with. It was, I think, her benediction on this world for all of us that she was leaving. And what I really loved about that when I found out, because the police didn't tell us till about a week later, that detail. When my mom heard it, she burst into tears and she said, "It's true, isn't it? Love is stronger than death." And when I heard it, I thought, wow, when the killer fled, I bet he thought he'd silenced her forever and had the last word, and he didn't. She did. She had the last word that night, and that word was love. And I believe it will always be the last word on our lives. It will always be the most powerful force on earth, stronger than hate, stronger than any division there can be or any problem we have to surmount. And that's why I hope that we start talking about love a lot more in law schools and everywhere. Thank you so much.
So we'll take a 10-minute break, and then we'll have our final panel for the day.
And the